All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to this truly interdisciplinary panel, focusing on the theme on methods, applications, and empirical studies. We have 4 presenters from different departments. So without further ado, let's start with welcoming Dr. Cynthia Siew from Department of Psychology to present on leveraging on network analysis to uncover mental lexicon structure. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
So hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Siew. I'm an assistant professor from the Department of Psychology at NUS. And today I'll be talking about how we can use network analysis to study the mental lexicon. So I'm a psychologist. I care about what is in people's heads. And the mental lexicon is the part of long-term memory that stores all the words and concepts that you have learned and you have used over your lifetime. And I'm very interested in modeling the structure of our lexicons, basically. So the way that I've done this talk is a more of a high level kind of introduction to my work. And I hope that the people who are listening can take away 2 messages from today. One is about how network science is this really powerful, flexible set of tools that you can use to represent all kinds of complex systems. I'm focusing on mental or lexical structures, but the reason why it's so useful, you'll see later on. And then the second point is to sort of motivate why we want to use network analysis to look at cognitive and language networks. And the reason is that the underlying structure of these cognitive networks, they affect how people make use of information. So if you're trying to study how people process information or learn language, you're doing it without any sort of consideration of the structure, the representation. I think you're missing out on a big part, right? And I'll go through the second point very quickly, 5 different areas in which language networks have been used. Okay, so network science, what is it and why is it useful? So at the core, network science is a set of tools to study and model complex systems. These tools have a very long history from the branch of mathematics known as graph theory, 200, 300 years ago. And there has been a long history and long sort of development of network analysis. Sociologists use it to study like social networks. They developed a lot of the concepts of network science in the 60s and the 70s. More recently, physicists are getting on it, computer scientists are getting on it, sort of really leveraging on the existence of big data and developing the theory and the mathematics behind it even more in in the 2000s. So the next part is like what is a complex system, right? So a complex system is basically a system where you have, I guess, units, right? Pretty simple units that are highly sort of interacting with each other in a way that produces emergent behavior that you don't expect if you just focus on the individual entities or units that make up the system, right? So human society is an example of a complex system. And network science is a highly flexible set of tools. And to demonstrate how quote unquote general purpose it is, on the screen are 2 different types of networks and very different from each other. The one on the left is actually a social network of characters from the Lord of the Rings movie. And what is done in this graph is that the characters are the individual nodes that make up the network, and the connections between them are constructed based on co-occurrence in the same scene. So if we take the screenplay of like Lord of the Rings, and every time 2 characters co-occur in that same scene, we put a connection between them. So very simple rule, but you get a very complex structure out of it. And you find that Gandalf is the central character, right? Pulling all these different threads together, right? I mean, Gandalf is the white wizard in the middle. Okay. So the second kind of example of a network is a network of the internet. And so each node in this system is a computer. And if the two computers are able to talk to each other, to able to communicate with each other in some way, we put a connection between them. Again, very simple rule, but you see this quite beautiful image, I think, of the network of the internet. So now let's move on to networks that I work with. So these are language networks. The nodes in these networks are concepts, like individual concepts or words that we know. There are two, I guess, classes of networks that I study in my work. One is a network based on free associations or semantic associations or taxonomic relations. So the concept cat and dog would be connected to each other in that sort of network. So that's a network of free associations. And if you're very interested, you can Google for the Small World of Words project and see a nice map of these concepts connected to each other in a network. Now, the second kind of type of language network that I study is a network where the connections between the words represent form similarity. So whether the two words have similar sound patterns or similar spelling patterns. And again, I apply a very simple rule and I connect the words up in that way. And what we have is this language network. And what's sort of really, I think, a neat thing about networks in general is that many real world networks have this small world feature. So if you look at the overall structure of the network, it's big, it consists of thousands and thousands of nodes, but the average distance needed to connect any two words is usually pretty small, like 5 or 6. So the 6 degrees of separation sort of idea in social networks really comes from this idea of short distances between nodes in the network. Okay, so now something that's really powerful about network science is that you can also zoom in, right? So what I talked about was like, okay, overall, there's a global macro level structure. We can analyze the network at that level, but we can also really zoom in and look at the local neighborhoods of the nodes in the network. So my training was in psycholinguistics and I really like words. So what you have here is one of my favorite images, whereas this is just the words that sound like the word cat in blue and words that are spelled like the word cat in green, right? And you can see that these are just words that sound like, you know, the word cat, but there's some very interesting internal structure in these phonological or orthographic neighborhoods. And in fact, we can even combine these two sources of information to get something that I call a phonographic neighborhood. You can see even more complexity in the structure of the local neighborhood of these words. Okay, so very quickly, again, what you can also do with network analysis is to look at something known as a meso-level structure of the network. So you can look, you can apply community detection algorithms, and what it does is that it finds subclusters of nodes in the network that are more densely connected to each other than to nodes outside of its cluster. So we call that a community. And community structure is very prevalent in a lot of real-world networks. In language, we also find existence of community structure and in the phonological lexicon, so where the connections represent phonological relations or similarity between words, we find that these communities reflect these clusters, these phonological chunks, right? And it's just, you know, has all these implications for understanding how we process spoken words. Okay, so on to my second point, which is, you know, why go through all this work to model the network, right? From my perspective, I think if we want to understand how people process and learn information, we just need to pay attention to the structure of these networks, because these processes, these retrieval processes, will work on this cognitive structure. And so it's meaningful to try and figure out what that looks like and try and connect that information to language processing, for example. So I'll do this from the perspective of 5 different subtopics that I have done some work in. So the first one is just language processing. So pretty basic level word recognition processes. And what we find is that just the very broad level take-home message is that the structure of the phonological orthographic lexicon affects how quickly you process words. And how do we quantify aspects of this lexicon? We can use micro-level network measures known as degree or clustering coefficient to basically assign a value to words. And what we do is that we just do some word recognition experiments in the lab and see whether these values correlate with reaction time, error rates in terms of how people are processing spoken and written words. So just to maybe dive in a little bit about what is degree, what's clustering coefficient. Degree is basically the number of friends you have. Okay, so if you have many friends, you are a high degree node in a social network. If you have few friends, you are a low degree word. And so on the left here, you can see an example of a word that has either high or low phonographic degree. And basically in a phonographic network, if you have many friends, that actually helps you process the word better. You're faster, you're more accurate. And the general idea is that the higher degree sort of reflects this convergence of phonological and orthographic information that help to facilitate recognition. Okay. Now the second one is clustering coefficient. And this is really cool. It's basically like a measure of whether your friends are also friends with each other. So if your friends are all friends with each other, you all hang out, you all do things together, there will be a connection between your friend A and friend B, right? And that repeats across all of your friends. So then you would have a social network that looks like a high clustering coefficient neighborhood, like the word on the rightmost word on the screen. So that's a word with high clustering coefficient. And then on the left of it is a word with low clustering coefficient. And what's important to note is that they have the same number of friends, but the connectivity structure inside of the neighborhood is different. And that has implications for processing. In the case of a phonographic lexicon, the higher clustering facilitates word recognition. So we can also apply network analysis to look at how the networks themselves change over time. So dynamic structure of the language network. So we can look at this from the perspective of early language development. So what we basically do here, right, is that we can try and model what are the words, what is the structure of the linguistic input that learners are being exposed to, and what are the words that they are picking out from that linguistic structure. We can also model the words that the learner knows and model their internal structure. And what we're trying to do generally here, there's some references if you read more, but very generally, we're trying to see if we can use network structure of the linguistic environment and network structure that's in the learner's head to predict what words they might learn next. And what we find is that, they do predict learning. They do predict a trajectory of words that are learned over time that you don't get if you just sort of looked at the individual properties of the words. Okay, so it's not a very long time, so I won't go into that much detail, but there's this sort of rich gets richer idea. Like if you have many friends, you tend to get more friends. That idea actually seems to work early in development in terms of learning phonological forms of words, but then that sort of bias sort of flips later on. And I think that is related to the fact that your phonological space that is being represented in memory gets filled out very quickly with a preferential rich gets richer kind of process. And when you get to the end, actually, you prefer learning the periphery of your phonological space. Okay, so point, I guess, example number 3 is that we can also make use of network analysis to try and model like how are second language learners representing phonological information of the language and the words that they're trying to learn in their minds. So this is a collaboration with Vivian and Nicole. And what we basically did was to ask learners to provide words that sound similar to a given cue word. So if I gave you the word, let's say we just use the word dog, you just have to produce the word that you think sounds like it, right? And there's no right or wrong answer. Just come up with a word that you think sounds similar to it. And we can collect all of this information. It's a very simple task, but we collect all of this information, and then we can model the phonological lexicon of L2 learners, and L2 learners of English. And we also have the same data for native speakers of English. And what we find is that the L2 networks had neighborhoods that were less well connected, and they had a structure that was less small. So to put it simply, they don't have a structure that is very efficiently organized. There are gaps in sort of their phonological representations of similarities between words. And that's really cool, right? Because we find these broad level things, but there are implications for using this information to maybe triangulate parts of the phonological lexicon that L2 learners might be struggling with, and then provide support, right, to grow that part of the network, with intervention or with training and so on. Okay, so then the fourth one is that we can also, this is again work done with other fantastic collaborators. And what we were trying to do here is to see if the structure of the mental lexicon could predict the type of errors that people with aphasia might make. So aphasia is a pretty common sort of language disorder that tends to happen when someone has a stroke. And then there are problems with language production, with speech, with comprehension. And very commonly, what we want to study their lexical retrieval processes. We give them a very simple task, which is like, okay, here's a picture. Let's say it's a picture of a dog. Just try and name it, right? Just try and name it. And you find that we take this for granted, but for someone with aphasia, this is an extremely difficult task, and they make a lot of errors. Usually the way that clinicians or speech therapists is like, what they do is that they just count the number of errors. But actually, the type of error that they make is also very interesting. And so what we did was to, instead of just counting the error, we want to know where the error occurred in the mental lexicon, right? And whether there's any aspect of that structure that can be used to understand why they make such an error, right, in the picture naming task. So we find this very interesting, finding where words that have many neighbors, so these are like the high degree words, they actually tend to be more accurately named than if they had few neighbors. And this is partially true due to the fact that when you have many neighbors, you have more potential opportunities, more paths tend to come to you in the network. However, when you do make an error on such a word, you get a very weird kind of error. You get an error that reflects a mixture of phonological information and semantic information. So anyway, so that's for this bit. And just to very quickly finish off with the last one, instead, this is some work that I also did where I'm trying to see if we can also model the structure of novices, students learning a subject for the very first time. How do they represent information? How do they make sense of it? So the way that we try and capture this information is by having students or participants do something known as a verbal fluency task. Now in psychology, again, we usually just count the number of, I should have explained what the fluency task is. So a very simple example is if I were to ask you to name as many animals as you can think of in like 2 minutes. Yeah, it's a very simple task, right? But you have to search for the information in your semantic memory. And the words that you come up with, the animals that you come up with, reflect that structure. And we can sort of reverse engineer your fluency response to infer what's the most likely network structure that you might have that would give that string of animals. So very simply, we apply the same task to, okay, just name as many concepts as you can with respect to a given academic domain, let's say psychology, let's say biology, anything. So we use those fluency responses and we sort of reverse engineer to find, okay, this is the most likely semantic network structure. And then we analyze that structure, right, using network analysis. And what we find is that actually, if you look at the graph on the figure on the right, NUS is the NUS graduates, and then NUSH is NUS high school students. And what you find is that the novices, the high school students are the novices here because they have no prior, I guess, experience with the topic of psychology, which is what this graph was representing, or this networks are representing. You find that, again, their representation of academic domains not as efficiently connected. And it has a structure that's a bit more like modular, right? Sort of very like big, obvious chunks of things, probably things that you've learned maybe like in a particular like topic or lecture topic, and not really able to make the connection, for example, between two lecture topics. But an experts, quote unquote, experts network looks better connected, is more efficiently connected as a small work structure. There are more connections between communities of knowledge. And I think that's kind of cool. I think that has sort of implications for thinking about how can we maybe optimize the trajectory from novice to expert, and think about more carefully about, okay, what are the implications of this structure for learning, for retrieval, for being a creative problem solver, of the future, right? Okay, so I think that's it from me. Went a bit over time, but just to very quickly reiterate, network sciences is really powerful, flexible set of tools for representing complex systems. And here I'm just focusing on mental structures or cognitive structures. And there are 5 different sort of areas that I do some work in each of these, and they all point to the same take-home message, which is that the structure of cognitive networks affects how people process and learn information. And if we care about how people learn and process information, we need to think about cognitive structure, and networks is a great way to go about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk on the network structure and where they're being applied. Okay, I think we'll leave the Q&A to the last. So if the audience will have questions, you could start to type, and then when we finish all the presentation, we will take the question and ask the panelists to respond. All right, so let's move on to the second presenter, Professor Kenneth Dean from the Department of Chinese Studies and the Asian Research, and he'll be talking to us about Singapore studies and the digital humanities. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chen-Chieh, and thank you for the invitation to present these materials, and also to all the organizers of this event and my fellow panelists. Very interesting talk just now from Cynthia. I want to share my screen and go into my slides. Okay, so Singapore studies in the digital humanities, right? So today I want to talk about 3 areas of digital humanities research, that dealing with textual materials, spatial materials, and networks, social networks or other types of networks. And I'll give some examples out of the recent research that some of my research teams have been working on. A TEI, a Textual Enhancement Initiative for Chinese Epigraphy of Singapore, GIS maps for ritual alliances of the Putian Plains, the Singapore Historical GIS, and then for social networks, the Singapore Biographical Database, and our Ching Tombs project, and they'll mention a few other future projects underway. But yeah, so before I really get into this, maybe, yeah, well, I'll just start into this, and then I'll try to come back and say a couple things about the challenges of digital humanities. One of the greatest challenges, as you know, is preservation and long-term sustainability. And that's why I want to mention that the library's digital humanities research team has just developed a new broad framework called Gatsby, which they're able to absorb all kinds of digital humanities projects into. They've also developed another one called Omeka S, which is especially good for maps and photo databases that are linked to maps. So they're working to develop a whole framework for digital humanities around NUS, and those of you in Singapore may want to find out more about that. They're also in the process of establishing in a few months' time something called the 360 IMAX or IMX, a kind of a cylinder in which you can display things in 360 all around you. So those of you interested in these kinds of things may also want to reach out to the library to start exploring those kinds of new data representation platforms. At NUS, we have a lot of projects in the digital humanities already very well established, like the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, set up by Yung Li Lan in English, Miguel Varela's Wayang site, Lim Beng Chu's Japanese theater site, and many, many more. So I urge everyone to have a look at what the library is trying to do through its Digital Gems initiative and through its efforts now to create broader frameworks to absorb and hopefully preserve over time many of the projects that are underway here. So getting back to my own projects that I wanted to introduce in relation to Singapore studies, this is a collection on Chinese epigraphy and basically includes about 1,265 inscriptions of different kinds. Some are stone inscriptions, others written on wood, some in the form of plaques, others in the forms of couplets, from a wide range of different types of Chinese institutions in Singapore. All of these include materials that dates to before 1911, but also later materials. Now, early period of Singapore, we know, is basically clustered around the mouth of the Singapore River, with each of the dialects in their own regions, their own neighborhoods. Here's the Tin Ho King down on Teluk Ayer when it was right on the ocean. And this is what it looks like now, surrounded by developments. Inside of there, we find some of these inscriptions that I'm talking about here, just to give you an example of what they look like. And what we've then done is to reproduce them in this way. These are other of the plaques, imperial plaques in this case. And this is a temple that's burned down, but which we can now preserve elements of through digital humanities. This was originally the main cemetery for the Hokkien community, and at least one or two of the objects in it have survived a fire that burned it down in some years ago. What we can try to do with these materials is find connections across Southeast Asia from the individual patrons. We can gather a lot of information on early Chinese clans and early Chinese businesses from them. We can convert it into TEI because that can then go into a lot of different formats, becomes a searchable digital version of the texts with a lot of metadata embedded in it. So here's an example of a series of cultural artifacts. Then here's the inscription, and then this is what we turn it into in our text format, TEI text format with labeling of different names and so forth. Basically, what this has allowed us to do is to find the names of about 48,000 individuals and over 10,000 Shanghao, businesses and Chuanhao boat companies that were active in the early period. It's the most comprehensive list that's been produced so far of these types of organizations, and thus useful for all kinds of different kinds of research into history of these regions. This is just a series of transformations we put the materials through. What we're able to then find in there as a crossover to some of our own material in our biographical database is we find quite a few of the same names that we have in that collection appearing in the inscriptions, as you would expect, because that database so far is mostly confined to about 1,000 Singaporeans. I'll get to that one next, but mostly of the elite status, whereas a lot of the people in these inscriptions are contributing members of particular temples and not necessarily all that connected. We have certain names that appear most frequently. Some of them will be familiar to you. And what we can then show graphically is how many, all these people are donating just to this one Fudatse, also on Teluk Ayer Street. But a number of them are also contributing to the Ningyang Huiguan. And then these people are contributing to all three of these different temples. So we begin to form a kind of a chart of the intermediaries between different temples who are reaching out in different ways to their community. This is another, this is a graphic representation of the Chaozhou community around the Wakhei Qingbiao on Phillip Street. And you'll notice it's all clustered in the middle. And that's because it's really a family business. It's all of Xie Qin and the Xie family interactivities. Whereas this version coming out of the inscriptions in the Hokkien temples shows a very different pattern, a dispersed pattern, where there's a lot of connections between individual merchants, banks, insurance companies, shipping companies, and so forth. Quite a different pattern emerges from the data representations that we can do with these materials. Okay, since I have very little time, I'll move quickly into the GIS for historical analysis. This is one project we've done on the Putian Plains based on fieldwork I did there in the 90s. It's information on about 700 villages, 2,500 temples, over 10,000 god statues, and all of the ritual activity that goes in there. The reason why it's important to put this stuff on a map is that we can also show the historical evolution of this entire region, which was underwater 1,000 years ago, and then was gradually filled in with the development of a complex irrigation system. And by figuring out the dates of the different villages and temples, we can gradually reconstruct the whole evolution of this irrigation system. And we can also show that at a certain point in the 1500s, the entire system transformed and moved beyond lineages controlling single villages into a ritual alliance formation of multiple villages along sections of the irrigation system who combine their forces to manage it and to maintain the increasing complex system. And they develop a whole new set of rituals and a new set of hierarchical temples at a higher order that everybody can, within those alliances, can attend on Chinese New Year's. So it's an example of how adding the data to the map raises new questions about what is the basis of these ritual alliances, where did they arise historically, what was their connection to the irrigation system. Various factors like that can then lead to new discoveries. Okay, I followed a lot of the migration out of Putian into Southeast Asia, following different religious migration networks. So we have Christians, we have Buddhists, we have 3-in-1, we have spirit mediums, all coming into different parts of Singapore and gradually expanding out into, or Southeast Asia, and some of them expanding into Singapore. What we've done with our Singapore historical GIS is we've tried to put a lot of this data up onto creating kind of a religious map of Singapore. So with 800 Chinese temples, 250 associations, 600 churches, over 100 mosques, over 30 or so Indian temples. We also have historical maps built into this so that you can toggle back and forth between different maps at different periods of time and find the locations of 200 former kampong, over 180 former cemeteries, the locations of over 550 Chinese schools that used to be around Singapore, most of them now gone. So we also done surveys and analyzed the temples into various classes of things. This very large category down here is spirit mediums in the HDB flats. And they are constantly trying to move from their apartments into a new temple space. So there's a push from below to create new temples, even as some of the temples are in decline. As I'll point out in a moment, they only have a 30-year lease for the most part, and many of them are now, especially under COVID times, under considerable stress, trying to figure out how to raise the money to get a new lease or move to a new location. In our GIS for Singapore, we have added all sorts of reports for about 250 of the sites. Our students went out in groups and did reports. They have photo albums, as well as a kind of general report on the history on each of these temples or associations. Now, this map allows us to explore certain strange phenomena in the distributions. For example, in Geylang, you see all of the lorong have lots of temples or associations or churches or so forth, a really high density. And we can try to explain that based on the fact that most of those Geylang locations have a longer lease of about 90 years. And so many of the associations and temples were forced out of their original location, have moved into Geylang, taking advantage of that extended lease. So certain of the distributions can be explained in various, using various factors like that. This is these were the early kampong in yellow, and the purple cemeteries that used to be around Singapore. The HDB you see behind them now took them over and basically eliminated most of those kampong and most of those cemeteries. Even the Choa Chu Kang cemetery is now just a fragment of its original self, since they're making such a big space for the Paya Lebar air base. They've dug up 82,000 tombs. Anyway, here you see what the HDB has really taken over everything, and so all these original sites are gone. Okay, our project tries to combine information from a lot of different sources into two different databases. One is a social network one is a historical GIS. And here you can see some of the kinds of sources that we're adding into that material. If you're interested, we've written this up in an online journal article, which you're very welcome to have a look at if you'd like more information. This is just a series of photos to show you a kampong being torn down and an HDB going up. Then some of the villages, all these were temples and villages, they all moved into this joint temple or united temple. Each temple becomes reduced down to one altar table. So this is a whole temple by itself, but there are now 13 of them in a giant hall. So this is a phenomenon we find in Singapore, about 350 temples in such united temples. This is an example of the difficulties for GIS research here. Temples have moved many times. This one has moved 4 times or 5 times. Anyway, yes, so it's hard keeping track of their movements. This is a case of a Jinmun temple that moved twice and then gave up and sent its gods back into retirement, back in Jinmun. They were sent back with some money to give them offerings for for eternity. But you can see nobody here is looking very happy. They all look a little glum at this having to give up their temple in Singapore and ask somebody else to take care of their deities. Now, we can also trace movements back from Fujian into Singapore. This is the language map, dialect map of Fujian, with the Minnan areas here. Putian, which I just mentioned, is here. Chaozhou is down here. Hakka regions over here. Okay. Along this coast are the founding temples or mother temples of some of the major god cults of the region, the regional pantheon. So we have Meijiu Mazu, Guangzu Zunwang, all these other gods, Qingshui Zushi, Anxi Chenghuang, Baosheng Dadi, etc. All of them can be found in Singapore. Mazu temples in red, Baosheng Dadi in blue, but you get the idea. We can follow the distributions across Southeast Asia as well as Singapore and trace the overseas expansion of a temple incense division network. Now, we've gathered a lot of data into this SHGIS, so it's a little hard to use. There's a video that explains how to take away layers so that you can then rebuild the ones you want. So I encourage you to look at that one first. But this is data on the COC, the Commission of Charities, giving the annual funding of all the temples that are on this list, several hundred temples, how much their finances for the last 3 years. So it's people interested in the economics of churches or of temples can get a lot of data out of this site. And we encourage collaboration based on these materials. So turning now to the SBDB, this was designed by Yan Yingwei, who gave a presentation earlier. He figured out a way to, using coding for websites, to allow this network to appear on the web and to be manipulable. So you can pull a point to the side and its surrounding connections will follow it. So it's quite a beautiful website that way. In it is a lot of information on Singaporeans over about 8 generations. And we can break it down by generation. There's a number of things that we are hoping to do to expand it. You can figure it out. As you can see, this is divided by dialect group to a large degree as well. So I encourage you to look at it and see what issues you might have with it or improvements that might be made to it. In it, we've used biographies, brief biographies of historical Chinese Singaporeans. And we've also now gathering larger and larger sets of data to try to incorporate into it. But we're faced with a challenge because it's one thing to handle on a screen about 200 people and their interconnections. It's another when you get into the thousands. So we're considering creating different layers to the Singapore Biographical Database to try to handle much greater sets of individual names and their connections to one another. Okay, including burial records. We have a lot of that information now. These are different kinds of sources that we're working to incorporate, but are still working on to bring it in. So one set of them that might be worth mentioning now is the tomb inscriptions. We've found close to 2,000 Qing Dynasty tombstones in Singapore, and we're trying to go through and make a study of them and publish them. They include Tan Tock Seng's tomb, some of you will know, on Outram Road. Here it is, and this is his son, Tan Kin Ching's tomb in the good old days in Changi. Now it's gone, and he has another one here in Bukit Brown. This is Xie Qin's tomb, which is still standing. A lot of really interesting inscriptions. It's quite a huge tomb, as you can see, and has quite a lot of poetry still traceable. It includes 2 of his wives. This is, so Zhang Hongning's tomb, and we have a lot of his family members' tombs as well. Same is true for Tan Tock Seng. This is one of the secret society founders. As you see, it says Ming instead of Qing. They're rather fun. And a very interesting case. These early cemeteries of the different dialect groups around old Singapore, we've been able to figure out their locations and the movements of the tombs out of them into the Bukit Brown and surrounding cemeteries that took place around the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. Into clusters in Bukit Brown. So these are clusters of Qing tombs moved from their original locations. And there's our students going out and finding them, transcribing them. This is the oldest tomb we found in Singapore, 1826. This is the oldest tomb of a Buddhist monk that we found in Singapore. Yeah, that's it, from 1847. And his novice from 1859. And we're able to trace a lot of these places of origins of these people's tombs back to Fujian, to close to 1,000 places in Fujian. Some of them are sites in which 40 or 50 people came at a very early period or in a specific period, probably in one boat. So we think we can do quite a lot to understand more of the history of immigration by analyzing these kinds of patterns. Okay, we're also expanding this into Malaysia. Chen-Chieh, you have to stop me if I'm going to talking too long. How much more time do I have left? 还有没有时间？我听不见，听不见。
Sorry, maybe another minute or 2.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is, we're expanding into Malaysia, and we've got about 4,000 sites there of associations and temples. Some of them we had no idea existed, and we've only found by driving around in recent period to find them. This is the Georgetown area. Here you see a new, well, let's see, if we move in here, we can see that some of these are from the works of Wolfgang Franke back in the 1980s. Others are sites that we gathered from online materials, and others are from lists of associations and their locations. So we're able to, and these green dots are added by researchers at a Malaysian university just walking through the streets and taking notes and photos and GPS coordinates of temples that nobody knew existed until they are added to this database. These are the new villages of Malaysia set up in the 1950s emergencies. A lot of them gather together lots of temples that used to be scattered quite widely. And so we're studying that as well. Okay. This is another project in Singkawang, where we found almost 1,000 temples in a town of only 600,000 people. They all participate in a vast, and these are some of the sources, this is the way we're organizing these materials for that website. They all participate in this big procession, Zap Gome, of about 1,000 spirit mediums. Here you see some images from that procession. A lot of people from the Dayak community also there participating, and a lot of Chinese actually involved in that too. This just as Dayaks or learning from the Dayaks how to be possessed by Dayak spirits. Quite an interesting cross-cultural phenomenon. Okay, I think I better stop, but I'll just use the last bit to show that inscriptions can be used to show us a history of the expansion of the Chinese diaspora, tracing it to datable sources gathered by Wolfgang Franke in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. We can see in each century the distribution patterns, the basic distribution patterns, and form a pretty accurate depiction of who's moving where, and thus allowing us to get into why those distributions are the way they are. Okay, I think I better leave it at that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this with you all today.
Okay, thank you very much for the very rich, extremely rich presentation on different aspects of digital humanities. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. My colleagues are AP Elaine Ho from Department of Geography and Asian Research Institute. She will be presenting on shared spaces and thrown togetherness in later life. Yes, please, Elaine.
Thanks, Chen-Chieh. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Let me just maximize it. Okay, so thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to present, and also for just bringing together a very diverse range of presentations on computational social science, which has helped me to catch up with the field very efficiently. So I hope that this presentation fits with the theme of computational social science. I never quite thought that it did, but so I was surprised, when asked to share a presentation. So I hope you'll find this helpful. This is a presentation based on a paper that's already been published in a journal called GeoForum, and it's co-authored with my colleagues Shalina Huang, Brenda Yeo, as well as Liu Jian-an and Chu Tuan-yi, who used to be at the Asia Research Institute but have since left. They were part of a research team for a project on transnational relations, aging and care ethics that was hosted at the Asia Research Institute. So I should start my timer. So my presentation focus is really on older peoples. I'll call them seniors from here on because older adults is a bit of a mouthful. So seniors' experiences of intercultural relations in Singapore, in particular, given the demographic changes that they're experiencing because of rapid aging in Singapore, as well as new immigration trends. And I situate this presentation in geographical literature on old age and space. So how people's experiences of aging is not only co-constructed in space, but also evolves through space in tandem with aging. And in this paper, we focused on this idea called micropublics. Okay, so micropublics are namely semi-public spaces, okay, or semi-private spaces that are open to the public, but which have a private character. And our presentation will focus on the shared spaces that are inhabited by non-migrants. And here I'm referring to Singaporean citizens or Singaporean seniors, and how they occupy shared space with temporary migrants. In particular, the group that we have studied are grandparenting migrants from the People's Republic of China. So essentially, our key sort of argument here is non-migrant and migrant encounters in public space should be analyzed in conjunction to better understand how aging in place and what we call aging across borders shape one another. So in the literature, there has been a lot of emphasis on aging in place, and this applies mainly to Singaporean seniors who are non-migrants. But with the arrival of PRC grandparenting migrants who are aging across borders, we want to argue that their presence in public space shapes the aging experiences of Singaporean seniors too. So I will just very quickly cover this slide on conceptual framing. So in the paper, we draw from the literature on encounters, conviviality, and public space. And these are mainly arguments presented by qualitative researchers in geography and sociology. Okay, and these the work done studies how different social conducts manifest. Okay, meaning when people are put together, they experience thrown togetherness, how do they manage cultural difference? So overall in this paper, we put qualitative research findings alongside GIS analysis. So in reviewing the literature on encounters, conviviality, and public space, we found that such research is limited to situations where there is co-location in space and time. So this means that people from different social backgrounds are in the same space, in the same time, at the same time in these kinds of studies. And we want to suggest that we actually need to study the distinct qualities and different permutations of co-location, okay? Because co-location doesn't necessarily lead to meaningful co-presence. Okay, so you can be at the same space at the same time, but not have meaningful co-presence through social interactions. So we turn to the GIS literature, and Shaw and Yu, they refer to three space-time relationships. So the three relationships here are co-location in time, co-location in space, and coexistence. So essentially, they have broken down this idea of co-location. With the first, these are activities that interact with one another within a common time window. With the second, co-location in space, these are activities that occupy the same location, but in different time windows. Okay, so in these cases, there may not necessarily be co-presence. And coexistence, the last one, are activities that take place at the same location and within a common time window. So in the rest of our analysis, we therefore looked at different kinds of shared spaces, and we analyzed the experiences of co-location through these frameworks. So our approach is we argue that it is important to distinguish different space-time permutations while deepening understanding of people's subjective experiences. So in other words, we want to bring together GIS analysis and approaches with people's subjective experiences that can be studied through qualitative research. And I should add that I am a qualitative researcher. So the colleague who actually contributed to this, and I forgot to add his name to this opening slide, was Guo Zhou, who was our postdoctoral fellow, but he's actually left for a job in China now. So in the paper, through putting together our qualitative and GIS knowledge, we argue that it is valuable to bring together multiple ways of knowing and making knowledge through qualitative GIS. And to us, importantly, it is not merely about a methodological approach. It's a methodological route towards conceptualization. So in the paper, we triangulated different forms of evidence. In the wider literature on qualitative GIS, they have mentioned different kinds of methods here, which I will not repeat. Later on, I will tell you specifically what our project used. But ultimately, the argument is through integrating qualitative and GIS techniques, we can produce richer and more robust understandings of the social world. So our study context is in Singapore. So we're looking at Singaporean seniors and grandparenting migrants from China who are in Singapore. And in Singapore, as I think many of you would know, the ethnic Chinese from mainland China comprise the largest group of new immigrants. And they are, however, considered cultural outsiders despite sharing the same ethnicity as the majority Chinese population. So I will not go into the background here because I've published about it elsewhere and I don't really have the time to elaborate. But when we are thinking about the new mainland Chinese immigrants in Singapore, we came to realize as well that many of them have young families, okay? So how do they manage childcare? In particular, given that in Singapore, it is very difficult for immigrants to bring in their parents and family members who are outside of the nuclear family. So we found that these PRC immigrants, they would ask their aging parents to come to help with childcare using temporary social visit or tourist visas. So they can only stay for short periods of time, 1 month, 3 months, sometimes a little bit longer. So what we've observed is that in certain housing estates in Singapore, these PRC seniors, they actually engage in childcare and leisure activities alongside Singaporean seniors. And we identified the Greater Jurong region. This is a term we use to talk about the different areas, okay, within or near Jurong that we have studied. So Greater Jurong region is a residential estate where both you can see lots of seniors as well as new immigrant families. And then we carried out fieldwork in Jurong to focus on the spaces shared by the Singaporean and the PRC seniors. And we were particularly interested to see whether the two groups interact, and if so, what is the nature of their interactions. So I'll talk a bit about my methodology next. On the left-hand side of my screen, you will see a map, okay, and the map actually identifies the shared spaces that we sort of identified using GPS tracking. So let me tell you a bit about our methodology. We use qualitative GIS to study the spaces used by Singaporean and PRC seniors. So this sample size is not huge, okay, but the research methodology had several different stages. And actually in the wider project, we interviewed, I think, more than 100 Singaporeans and PRC seniors in total. So they were recruited through personal contacts, and our researchers also went to activities that were organized for the seniors, and we used these contacts to snowball for further contacts. So our fieldwork consists of 4 stages. We started with a semi-structured opening interview to identify the suitability of the participant for follow-on, go-along interviews and 7-day GPS tracking. And then following these steps, through the GPS tracking, we generated maps that we used to conduct concluding interviews to ask the seniors about the places they go to, why they go there, and to also observe what their mobility patterns are like. So for this particular paper, what we did was we overlaid the participants' GPS tracks to identify those that intersected in shared spaces. So the participants were recruited separately, and through their GPS tracking, we then identified, the places where they go to, but not necessarily one another, okay? So we then selected the 3 most frequented spaces to conduct follow-on ethnographic fieldwork. So this approach enabled us to, from a grounded approach, identify, which are the the shared spaces that are used by both Singaporeans and the PRC seniors. And then the interviews and qualitative research helped us to investigate further their motivations, their experiences, etc. So alongside this, in our analysis, we also generated space-time path maps, and I'll share them with you later. But essentially, they are 3D visualizations that depicts an individual's movement in space and time. And the space-time maps can be understood using Shaw and Bree's framework of co-location in time, co-location in space, and coexistence. Another way which we contributed to the qualitative GIS methodology was we used visual and textual data to produce what Whitesell and Faria have called global intimate maps. So I'll share with you these maps later. So essentially, if you look at the map on the left, the triangles identify the shared spaces that were derived from the GPS tracking. And here, this is an example of a global intimate map. And what we have done is apart from just showing the map and the mobility patterns, we have also provided photos and quotations from our ethnographic and qualitative research to illustrate, what these spaces are like. I won't go into detail here because I've still got quite a few things to cover. Essentially, our research questions then we wanted to understand what types of spaces are shared between non-migrant and migrant seniors and why. To what extent do they interact in these spaces, and how do these interactions inform their respective experiences of aging in place or aging across borders? So from the conceptual framework, the methods and the research questions, we then analyzed 3 types of shared spaces that emerged through our research. The first is asynchronous encounters in a mixed services space. The second is it's about informal spontaneous encounters in a public park. And the third is about formal organized encounters in a community club. So I hope laying it, the 3 types of spaces this way helps you to identify, what are the nuances that we're looking for in the different kinds of spaces. I'll start with the asynchronous encounters first. So on the right-hand side, this is an example of a space-time map. So it's a map that shows the vertical axis shows progression across time, and the horizontal axis shows the geographical extent of a person's activity space. And alongside this map, we also superimpose the photos that we took during our ethnographic observations. So I'll tell you the significance of the 2 kinds of photos and timings here shortly. An asynchronous space for us is one that is not conducive for fostering interactions. And here we notice from 3 of our participants' GPS tracks that they all use the same mixed services space, which contains a family service center, a childcare center, a kindergarten, and leisure or fitness spaces. So the Singaporeans in our study, Madams Rosma and Loy, they attend the same Zumba class, which is organized by a voluntary welfare organization. Madam Chen, who is from China, she visits the space as well, in fact, multiple times a week, because she brings her grandchild to the childcare center there. So from the space-time map, we observe that they share a space and they have nearly contiguous temporalities, but they do not actually interact with one another in this space. So the space-time paths can be described as co-located in space, okay? But there are reasons that prevent them from coupling, we found throughout interviews and ethnographic research. So the open air area here, which is used by the childcare center around 8 a.m., it must be cleared by 10 a.m. for the seniors to practice Zumba. So Madam Chen brings her grandchild to the childcare center, but she doesn't linger. So she's unaware of this activity that's going on for the seniors. She also experiences capability constraints. She can't read the English signs. She lacks the social networks, unlike the Singaporeans who are aging in place, and they have developed local networks over the years. There are also authority constraints, which we identify, we define as the rules or laws that lead to differentiated inclusion. So for Madam Chen, because she's a foreigner, she has to pay higher fees to attend activities organized by the government and DWOs. So instead of doing so, she doesn't want to pay these higher rates. She says she feels it's unfair. She actually created her own dancing group for other PRC grandparents. And so they have a little social circle amongst themselves. So this is an example of an asynchronous space that illustrates how seniors who age in place and those who age across borders might lead parallel but separate lives because of the programming of these activities in a mixed services space. They share the space, but they don't actually have the opportunity to interact. So co-location in space alone is insufficient to foster intercultural interactions. Now, in the interest of time, I want to go to the third kind of space, which is about formal organized activities that take place in a community club. And we found through our study that these kinds of activities, because they foster a common goal, they can actually sustain more in-depth social interactions that are conducive for cooperation. So this is actually an activity that we call the senior catwalk. So these are Singaporean and PRC seniors. As you can see, they're all women, and they're learning how to model, okay, in later life. They feel that it kind of improves their confidence, okay? So you can see from this figure here, we share some of the quotations. So catwalk can boost your own confidence. It boosts your confidence in your own image and also adjust your walking posture. But you will see also from this photo that in the interviews, we found that this is a space where it facilitates more positive interactions, and these participants talk about being good friends, and they have a common goal that they are working towards. Basically, they are preparing to stage a performance for a community event. So they are actually very keen to show how their event, is more international compared to the others. And in our research, we found that the PRC seniors, they actually bring with them knowledge about catwalk. The instructor is a PRC grandmother, and they also bring with them costumes. For example, here we refer to a flute performance. I don't have time to go into the details. So this is an example of how a shared space through formal organized events that foster a common goal can be conducive towards promoting positive social interactions. So the group coheres because they return each week. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Chen-Chieh. I'm out of time, right? It's 15 minutes, right? Or am I going to? Sorry, Chen-Chieh, you're muted.
15 to 20, but probably try to wrap up soon.
Wrap it up
we
soon.
Still have,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so actually I can go back to the previous slide to talk a little bit more about it then. So in this particular space that we studied, actually we were very fascinated by the silver catwalk. It's a kind of space that emboldens the seniors to resist the negative definitions associated with old age. And actually in this shared space, part of the reason why the non-migrants and the migrants cohere is because they have resources to share with one another. As I said, the PRC seniors bring with them knowledge about modeling, they bring with them the costumes that are used in the performances, but they also experience an authority constraint. So in this particular space, as foreigners, they cannot book facilities at the community club. And as a result, it's the Singaporeans who do the administrative work and they liaise with the external personnel in the community club, whereas the PRC seniors contribute through their knowledge of Chinese dance and purchasing costumes and props. So what we argue in this particular space is where mutual interests are served, what could have been considered an authority constraint actually becomes a reason for collaboration and negotiation across difference. So importantly here, the two groups, non-migrants and migrant seniors, they find that they have mutual interests and therefore it helps to facilitate positive intercultural relations. So I just want to summarize the findings. I didn't have time to talk about the public parks. So I think what makes this presentation related to computational social science is we didn't identify these these shared spaces randomly. We actually used the GPS tracks, thousands of data points and looked at the intersection of the GPS data in order to identify the most productive spaces for us to conduct follow-on qualitative work. So what we found is the mixed services space, there are certain placemaking dynamics, right? So the local networks enable the Singaporean seniors like Madam Rosma and Madam Loy to receive information that facilitates their participation. But the PRC seniors are excluded from these social networks and they face language difficulties. So they therefore feel excluded from social mixing. And we have described this as asynchronous encounters despite using the same space, being co-located. In the public park, which I did not talk about, it's actually an example of two groups that do Tai Chi, and both groups actually comprise of both Singaporeans and PRC seniors. So there's a common interest and they are able to communicate in Mandarin, and that facilitates interactions between the Singaporeans and the PRC seniors. But we argue that the public park encounters, they are informal, so they are organized by the seniors themselves. There's no sort of formal structure. So the encounters are spontaneous, but they cannot actually foster deep bonds. They exercise together and then that's it. The rest of the day, they don't interact. Whereas with the Silver Catwalk at the community club, there are opportunities as well as constraints. So the constraints, for example, faced by the PRC grandparents, they are unable to book the facilities, results in them finding that the Singaporeans can help them do so. And the Singaporeans benefit also from the knowledge and resources shared by the PRC seniors. So because they're practicing towards a community event, it fosters shared goals and it results in a mutually enriching relationship that at the same time for us, it was really interesting to see how the catwalk can transform their aging subjectivities in that shared space. So to conclude, in this presentation, we use both GIS and qualitative methods, and we want to argue that this combination of methods actually provides a fuller perspective of the seniors' life worlds. We integrated GPS tracking with GIS analysis, maps, as well as ethnographic observations, interviews, and other visual methods. And as a result, through these different methods, we excavated and we could present multiple forms of data that brings together a fuller picture of what the seniors' life worlds are like. And we also developed grounded visualizations through the maps, through the photo collages that depict the actual routes and spaces, as well as how the interview quotations bring across the embodied and emotional dimensions of shared spaces. Now, theoretically, what the paper achieves is identified intersections between the fields of aging, migration, and public space. And I want to end by emphasizing that we need to pay attention to how migrant seniors use our residential neighborhoods as well, because neglecting to address that in terms of how non-migrants and migrants experience migration in their neighborhoods means that we are not attentive to how the seniors negotiate social difference in their later life. And that leaves a gap in our knowledge of how aging and space are co-constructed. Okay, I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for the rich talk on, so basically mixed method approach with ending with some policy implications. All right, so our next speaker is Zhong Songfa from Department of Economics. So his talk is about individualism, collectivism, and risk perception around the world. Please, Songfa.
So thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So, okay, so thanks for this great opportunity to learn from our colleagues about computational social sciences. And I'm going to talk about this paper. Unfortunately, I guess it's not so computational because you'll see I will just use like very simple regression analysis. Okay, so this joint work is Wu Zhe, who is a graduate student in the economics department. I think he's also in the audience, and I guess he's responsible for answer any question you might have. So today we'll talk about this project on risk perception. So we know risk perception is essentially one of the cornerstones in decision making. For instance, like the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So the public and the scientific communities, we hold different views about the risk associated with COVID-19, and that is going to determine how best we think we are going to respond to it. And we also see like various ways that people perceive risk differently, like how bad is the climate change, what's the risk associated with artificial intelligence. So some of these, there's scientific facts there, but people may still see them differently because they may interpret the facts differently based on their background, personal experience, various sort of things. And the problem of having differences in risk perception is very so often we tend to base on our own perception of risk and generalize that to others. And this may lead to things like disagreement, polarization, and sometimes even conflict. So then the general question that of interest for this project is asked, whether to what extent culture may offer an explanation for risk perception differences around the world. And for individualism and collectivism continuum, here we mean, roughly speaking, is a degree that people focus on their internal attributes and differentiate themselves from the rest. Okay, so we're mostly interested in two different hypotheses, and both hypotheses center around an observation that a social group tend to provide a sense of mutual insurance for its members and provide them protections if there's people are in need. So on one hand, we can see that when people are more pessimistic, so in a way that can be seen as a form of risk perception. When people are more pessimistic, then perhaps they have a greater need for mutual insurance. And this may give rise to a sense of social group and a connectivistic culture. And this is one hypothesis. In this hypothesis, pessimism may link to connectivism. And the other hypothesis is the reverse part of it, is to imagine that when people in the connectivism culture, under this kind of culture, they got protection from the social group, and then in a way they have some form of mutual insurance. And this may give rise to a sense of optimism and affects how they perceive risk. So essentially these two hypotheses tend to go in different ways. And in the existing literature on decision science and psychology, there has a number of studies testing one of these two hypotheses, one or the other. But most of the existing studies rely on like cross-country comparison of several, compare between United States and China, or Hong Kong and Taiwan, like very small scale. So in this paper, we try to provide a first study on the relationship between individualism and connectivism continuum and risk perception around the world. So we're going to build on the data set on risk perception recently available, the so-called Royal Register Foundation World Risk Pool. The pool was conducted in 2019, and the data was recently available, I guess, last November. So it's a Dutch pool conducted in 142 countries and territories around the world, with on average 1,000 participants from each country. So overall, it has a sample size of 150,000 participants. So the survey itself contains risk perception from various domains. But for our study, we are going to focus on risk perception on 7 domains of daily risk, like the food, water, violence, crime, severe weather events, electrical power lines, household appliance, and mental health. In part because for these 7 domains of risk, they have a more systematic way of asking the risk perception of the individual. So essentially, there's 3 types of risk perception related questions. The first one is about the perceived likelihood, asking, say, how likely do you think that in each of the following things could cause you serious harm in the next 2 years? So risk perception, perceived likelihood is an important aspect of risk perception. To understand, it captures a kind of cognitive judgment. How do you judge the likelihood for a certain thing? And the second one is about worry, asking, in general, how worried are you for each of the following things that could cause you serious harm? So worry is yet another dimension of risk perception. It can capture a sense of emotional reaction to the potential risk. And the third one is about experience, asking how you or someone personally know that experienced serious harm for any of the following things in the past 2 years. So we think that risk is very important for us to control individuals' personal experience, because otherwise that the kind of risk perception may actually, for certain, it's going to reflect a lot of personal experience. Right? So based on these 3 questions, we are going to conduct two indexes or 2 gaps. The first one is on the perceived likelihood experience gap, captures to what extent people perceive a risk more or less likely relative to their actual experience. And the second index is on worry experience gap. It captures to what extent people worry more or less relative to their actual experience. And these 2 variables are the 2 major two measures that we capture risk perception. And for individualism, we're going to look at 2 aspects as well. The first one is on contemporary individualism. We have 2 measures here. First one is the well-known holistic individualism, captures the degree that people focus on their internal attribute. And the second one is constructed from the World Value Survey. There's several questions on family tie, and it captures to what extent family members are closely tied. And we are also interested in the historical root of risk perception. So we examine the historical individualism based on the recent constructed index by Feng. So this kinship tightness measures the extent that individuals in a pre-industrial society, to what extent they are embedded in interconnected extended family networks. And the kinship tightness, it has 2 subscales. The first one is on family structure, and the second one on distance system. We are going to look at them separately as well. So then with this data, we move on to basic results. And this is a work map on risk perception for the 3 questions on risk perception and the 2 gaps. Okay, so the first one and the first and the second one are on the perceived likelihood worry. So you can see the perceived likelihood worry, they share very similar distribution around the world, although there's some difference in, say, Africa. But mostly we can see individuals in the South America and Africa, they tend to have a higher perceived likelihood on the risk, and they tend to worry more. And the perceived likelihood worry seems to closely map to their actual experience, but we can still see that there's difference. So in the panel D and E, when we simply subtract the likelihood experience and worry and experience, we can see there's a lot of differences, right? So in particular, in South America, for instance, people tend to perceive higher likelihood relative to their actual experience, and similarly also worry more than relative to their actual experience. And by contrast, for example, in the North American, people that do not seem to experience a substantial difference between their perceived risk and their actual experience. So our goal here is to think about whether the two indexes on individualism, the contemporary one and the historical one, to what extent can help us explain part of these global differences in the risk perception. So we first just give a kind of a scattered thought. The x-axis here, so is the on the left-hand side is the hostage individualism, and the y-axis here is the likelihood experience gap. And you can see here there is a negative relationship. So when the individualism score gets higher, the gap between the likelihood and experience tend to be smaller. So on the other hand, in the more, when the individualism score is lower, those, say for example, on a connectivism culture, they tend to have a bigger gap. A similar pattern you can see when we look at the right-hand side on the worry experience gap. So individualism culture, people in this kind of culture tend to worry less relative to their actual experience. And so this is based on the hostage individualism measure. When we use alternative measure on work value survey Fermi tie, we can see a similar pattern. So when the Fermi tie is stronger, so when x-axis the number gets bigger, then the likelihood experience gap also gets bigger. And similarly for the worry experience gap. So in both measures on contemporary individualism, whether you use hostage individualism or Fermi tie, we both see the same pattern. Individualism cultures tend to perceive less risk relative to their actual experience, regardless whether we use the likelihood experience gap or worry experience gap. Now we move on to the historical individualism. So the overall index of kinship tightness, we can see the line is actually more or less flat, and the correlation coefficient, although it's positive, but it's rather small and statistically insignificant. So then we continue to look at the two subscale of the kinship tightness. The first one is a feminist structure. So in the graph, you can still see this. There's a slightly positive correlation. The correlation size is like 8% and statistically insignificant between the feminist structure and the likelihood experience gap. We see that when the feminist structure is score is higher, then the gap is actually higher, but the size is quite small. When we move to the second subscale of this kinship tightness, the descent system, we can see that the correlation is literally, I guess, 0. Okay. So overall, then we see that the contemporary individualism tend to have a stronger link with risk perception differences around the world. But for the historical individualism measures, the correlation tend to be small. So, but this is just like scatter plot without control anything. So we consider running a simple regression analysis and to control some variables. So here we consider 3 classes of control variable. The first one is biogeographic controls. For example, distance to equator, average precipitation rate, etc. And the second group is the demographic controls variables. So these variables are available in the data based on the sample we have, basically age, gender, schooling, and urbanicity rate. The third class, economic institution and reasonable controls, such as GDP per capita, democracy, fraction of Protestantism, and fraction of non-religious. So we tend to see that the first group, biogeography control variables, are more likely to be exogenous relative to the individualism or risk perception. For demographics and these socioeconomic religions variables, they're more likely to affect the individualism or risk perception or being affected by these variables. So in our preferred analysis, we tend to use this the regression with biography controls. But nevertheless, we will continue to say if we add more control variables and what we see. Okay, so this is the table we see here is to consider the first column when we do not control anything, and this is about contemporary individualism and risk perception. When we start control anything, then you can see the individualism score is actually negative, and the feminine type score is positive. This is actually what we see in the figure just now. In the second column is our preferred specification, where you can see that when we control continent dummy and biography controls, so the coefficient gets smaller but remains statistically significant. And when we move to the column 3, then we control more. So here we control demographic. The coefficients remains similar, and we control economic controls as GDP per capita. Correlation is the coefficients more or less similar. Although here you can see that feminine type becomes statistically insignificant, but coefficient-wise still sizable. And when we move to the column 5, then we control institution, and the last one we control religions. When you control the religion, then you can see, relatively speaking, for example, for the worry and experience gap, the correlation coefficient essentially reduced by almost 30%. And in the panel D, for the feminine type and worry experience gap, it becomes statistically insignificant. So this may reflect the fact that religion may be an important aspect of individualism. And in the data, we do see that religion, especially the share of Protestant in the population, is highly correlated with these individualism indexes. So in the paper, we also conduct the similar analysis for the historical individualism. So you can see most of the regressions are insignificant, but in our preferred specification, say the feminine structure, we can see that it's statistically significant between the feminine structure and likelihood experience gap. And it continues to be significant after we control a number of variables, except for the last one, the religion. So the coefficient is reduced by half. So this shares a similar picture that historical individualism tend to be weakly associated with risk perception. So we also conduct a number of rebalancing checks, but I don't think I have time to go through it. And to sum up, we showed that people from countries with stronger contemporary individualism tend to exhibit the lower perceived likelihood and less worry relative to their actual experience. And for the historical individualism, the overall pattern is much weaker, and we only observe some significant results for the perceived likelihood, but not for the worry. So overall, the result here is supports a link between connectivism and optimism. Also, I think it's a typo. I think it should be connectivism and pessimism. Yeah. So people from a connectivism culture, then they tend to worry more. Yeah. So our study also consistent with the distinction between perceived likelihood and worry, although they are closely related, and here we see some difference. Yeah, so worry tend to be perhaps more subjective to the context and the actual environment relative to the perceived likelihood. And it's generally very difficult to talk about the underlying mechanism in the simple linear regression. So it's possible that the historical kinship tightness has some interaction with the religion, for example, the share of Protestant in the population, and this may overall has some kind of behavioral feedback with risk perception and risk-taking behavior. But I think our study are not empowered, so do not have a statistical power to detect the more complicated structure. Overall, our study we tend to see our study as an addition towards a better understanding on global differences in behavioral traits. These days, there is more data available. There's a number of studies talking about global differences in how people taking risks, how people trade off intertemporal cell control problems, social preferences, things like that. Yeah, but ours is essentially the first study talking about risk perception. I think that's what I have. I guess I'm still on time, right? Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for all four presenters. We actually are right at the end of the session, but I think we should have some Q&A. So we have a few questions, 3 questions on the Q&A box. Okay, and these 3 questions, actually 2, are mainly for Professor Dean. So, because this is recorded, so I have to read out the question. So, Professor Dean, these are the questions for you. So the first one is, can I know how you were able to digitize the inscriptions in the tombs? What character recognition package was used? And the second one is actually related. So the second question is, Chaitanya asked, I would like to know if there is any reference for similar analysis done on Tamil language and its inscriptions in Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. For the tomb inscriptions, we have done our own transcriptions from the originals and done our best to enter those into a computerized format. There are real difficulties with certain variant characters. For those, we're sometimes able to draw on the Taiwanese variant character database, some of which is built into Unicode now. So it's a continuing struggle with transcription and character recognition. I believe there's some research into Tamil inscriptions going on in Singapore. There's a number of very interesting multilingual inscriptions that go back very early to the 1830s that include Tamil as well as Jawi and Chinese, and these are attracting more attention nowadays. But if you'd like to email me, please go ahead and I can try to point you to some of those, that kind of research going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps just quickly add up, there's another question from Nandan for Professor Dean. And the question is, how long does it take to convert a piece of epigraphic material to a TEI formatted document, including transcriptions and annotation?
That is a painful question. It's a very time-consuming process. First of all, one has to develop a hierarchy of taggings for the transcription process itself is a matter of retyping out the inscription, then cross-checking it several times for accuracy, and then labeling and setting up all the TEI standards for this genre of writing. A lot of that has already been done for Western epigraphy, but in the Chinese field, we're still creating some of the categories. So there's, yeah, it takes quite a lot of time. I can't give you a kind of one a standard answer because each of the inscriptions generates its own problems, especially because of the problem of variant characters, which are very extensive in the and multilingual characters in the early Singapore sources. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a straight answer to that one. It takes time, but it's usually worth it because you end up with a database that's searchable and can be linked into a lot of other comparative research, say across Southeast Asia, back to Fujian. I didn't have time to raise it, but that allows us, if we gather those sources in as well, to really trace a lot of trade and religious networks across the region. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so there is a question for Elaine. All right, this is in the chat box. So the question is from Chen-Chieh. So he asked how the study or how your study could capture those social isolated and what are findings in regard to this group of people?
Yeah, so the question is about socially isolated seniors. So to be honest, with this study that I've just presented, we weren't looking at socially isolated seniors because clearly there is because of the GPS tracker method, right? So we need to actually focus on people who are mobile. So whereas we did consider looking at seniors who perhaps don't go out as much, but what that would achieve would be very limited in terms of GPS tracking because mainly the GPS tracker would only capture their home location. So in a follow-up study, which is currently ongoing, we are looking at socially isolated seniors with a different methodology. So we have a survey as well as qualitative GIS. And I think the survey will be able to capture some of the experiences of socially isolated seniors. And then we can do follow-up qualitative interviews with them. Whether or not GPS tracking will still be useful, I think remains something which we have to think about more subsequently. So I hope this captures, this answers the question, but if not, feel free to drop me an email.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have a question for Cynthia. All right. So earlier you talked about quite a bit of the network science and as well as its applications in language. So you started by talking about network was developed in sociology. So I'm just curious about the network in sociology and network in language study. Is there anything that's more unique in language study in the use of the network? Because in geography, we also have transportation network and all sorts of things like that. So I'm just trying to figure out what would be the uniqueness.
Yeah, thanks for the question. What is unique about, well, my understanding of I'm not a sociologist, so if there are any sociologists around in the crowd, I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting the research, but my understanding is that they were very interested in trying to map out like an egocentric network. So they'll ask the person, okay, list the people that you interact with, and does this person know this other person? Does that person know this other person? And then what you get is a very sort of micro level representation of the person's social network. And then they try and study that in relation to maybe other things like well-being and so on. But that's my very, brief. And obviously, in social psychology, there is a quite, I think, like central study where someone actually tried to map out, okay, what's like the social network of, a whole country. And so they started out with I'll just go on a little bit because it's a fun experiment. So they started out somewhere in Kansas in the US, and then they gave letters to people, and they're like, okay, well, send it to this target person somewhere in the East Coast, I think, somewhere in the East Coast. And, by all accounts, the expectation was that the experiment would fail, right? Because the person doesn't know who this person is. And so they just send the letter to who they think might get the letter close to the target person. And the interesting thing is that you can actually find paths that are completed, right? And it's like on average about 6 or 7 steps. And so that's like a study from the 70s, right? And but the concept, I guess, of networks is that it's the the fundamental sort of the underlying network is always just like numbers and the connections between the nodes and the edges. I mean, Prof. Dean's, network is basically like this list of nodes and there's a list of connections, right? And fundamentally, that's it about networks. You can apply it to a lot of different disciplines. And I think what's sort of important, which maybe will tie it back into computational social science, is that you need the subject expert to come in and give meaning to the nodes and the connections. Because if you just have nodes and connections, yeah, you get a network, but what does it mean? So in the context of language networks, those are the nodes and the connections that I care about are words and the relationship between words, and they have that sort of implication for learning and memory and so on. But in someone else's, maybe studying social networks and you're trying to look for social isolates, right? We also have isolates in the language networks. So these are words like spinach and they have no phonological neighbors. So they're just little dots. And these are words extremely hard to retrieve in memory, right? And there might be a similar parallel with social networks, but that's where the subject expert comes in and applies what's meaningful to that network information.
Okay, thank you very much. And perhaps last, just a quick question for Songfa. So you talk quite a bit about, you talk quite a bit about control. So I was wondering, other than economics and religions and situation, are there other possible cultural control that may affect your risk perception results?
Thanks. We do consider like some other measures. I think there's a recent psychologist on something like the tightness of a culture, looseness and tightness of a culture. I think that would be a nice one, I guess. Yeah, but for this, we generally have a problem is just like not quite sure how, because a lot of these things are endogenously related. So the control itself, I think the meaning of it is sometimes like just difficult. But I think you are perfectly right. If anything, I have to choose from those like well-known cultural index, I guess like the tightness of the culture. Like I think that would be something very interesting to think about. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, I understand that there are 2 more questions on the Q&A box, but in the interest of time, would Chatana please send email directly to Prof. Dean for further clarification. So with that, I should let everybody know that there's still a keynote speak later at 7 p.m. by Chen-Chieh on employing social media to improve mental health. Okay, so just a reminder about that keynote later at 7 p.m. All right, and then with that, I thank everybody, every panels and the participant to be with us slightly over time. And thanks very much. And let's conclude this session.